Okay, so I've got the old tire off of the rim, and I want to clean the wheel up, and it's got some rust in here. This wheel needs a little bit of work before it goes back on. We're also, of course, going to do the wheel bearings. So before I put in the solvent tank and everything, I'm going to go ahead and show you how to take the wheel bearings out, and then later on, after we get the tire back on, I'll show you how to put the wheel bearings back in again. So taking them out is pretty easy. Take this cover off. Okay, so I've got the screws removed and the cover out. Now, you want to leave the bearings inside the hub for right now. You're going to take them all out as one unit, like one package, so to speak. And for that, you take the rear axle and put it in from the inside. And then you'll need some sort of spacer here. What we do is we have these series of spacers because there's different lengths of axles. We stack as many as we need here on there. Put the washer on, put the nut on, and tighten it all down. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat up the hub nice and warm, and then I'm going to tap the axle out, and in this way bring all the bearings out as one package. It's the way to do it, and this applies to all spoke rear wheels and drum front wheels that have spokes. For the other models, it's a little bit different technique, but this is how it's done here. So I'm going to get started now and heat this up. The smell of burnt spider webs. Okay, hopefully this is sufficiently heated. I think so. Okay, I've heated the hub to expand the aluminum, and now we should be able to just tap everything right out. Perfect. Comes apart complete with the spacers and the bearings. Now I'm going to clean the wheel up and show you how to redo the wheel bearings, and then we'll put it back together and reinstall the wheel. Okay, so I got this wheel pretty clean. It's way better than it was, and I put a fresh tire and tube on there. Now we're going to talk about wheel bearings. So this is the way that the wheel bearings came out in one pack. And I'm going to chuck those up in the vise here. And then take it back apart, take it all apart. These are my spacers. And this is the, oh man, I think stuck. There's a shim. Taking these parts off and the bearings off. I've chucked the axle in the vise here, and now I'm going to put all the wheel bearing components on there to check for the preload. So I got a new wheel bearing. It's no grease yet, just dry, like right out of the package. And the inner spacer, I'm going to start with the shim that came out of the wheel bearing set, because that's a good starting point. Outer spacer, and now the wheel bearing on so. And now I'm going to introduce my stack of spacers and tighten the nut down to about how tight a wheel bearing should be, and I can feel already, oh, that's tight. So first of all, very difficult to turn the bearings. This thing's just all locked up. So we're going to need to change the shim. So simply take the shim out, and this is the next size I've determined might work. And this one's too loose. You see, it's just flopping all over the place. That's not going to work either. So we need something right in the middle somewhere. And through a little bit of trial and error and a little bit of resurfacing, I came up with this shim, which should be just about perfect. So, rotate it a little bit to make sure. You should be able to push the spacer with pretty just moderate thumb pressure. That means you've got some preload on the bearing. And spins nice, but that's the main thing, that you want to feel that just moderate pressure so there's a little preload on the bearing. Now that I've determined that and I got the bearing sorted out, take it back apart, grease the wheel bearings, heat the hub up, and put the whole thing in as a unit, just the way it came out. Okay, greasing wheel bearings. For swing arm bearings and steering head bearings, we like to use LM47 from Liqui-Moly. That's the right grease, but for wheel bearings, you want to use something like this. This is LM50, or any good quality wheel bearing grease that you might find. If you have a wheel bearing packer, good for you. It'll come in handy. Stick it in there and pack the grease. If you don't, I'll show you how to do it by hand, the old-fashioned way. Put a suitable amount of grease in your hand, and then go around and press from the wide end of the bearing onto the edge of the grease until you see it kind of pushing through, and rotate and keep doing that all the way around the bearing until you've got a nice little puddle protruding out of the top of the bearing. And then you know that you've got the bearing fully greased on the inside. This is essentially what a bearing packer would do. And if you don't have one, you can do it with just a pair of gloves, I recommend. Okay, and then we throw a little bit around the outside. There's one. And do the same thing on the other side. So I got my bearings packed, and now I'm going to put them back on the shaft again. And just for good measure, I'm going to put a little bit of grease around that spindle. You don't have to go crazy, but the grease will flow when it gets hot. So having a little extra in there is not a bad thing. Okay, so now my bearing pack's ready to install. Next step is going to be to heat up the wheel hub to get it pretty darn hot. And then, if everything goes right, it'll slide right in. Yeah, for disassembly, it was hot enough to use the heat gun. But for reassembly, I'd want a little bit more heat. Actually, ideally, I want to get up to about 100 degrees Celsius or 200 and some degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm going to use a propane torch in this case, speed thing up a little bit. Okay, that should be hot enough. So now moving quickly, I'm going to put the bearing pack right in here. See how that just went right in? Don't need to press or anything. Give it a couple taps, then I'm going to set it down on the axle like that, let it cool, and go on to the next phase. In preparation for reinstalling the rear wheel, there's a few things we're going to do first, and that is put oil in the final drive and swing arm, very important. For oil, we're using the Liqui-Moly 85-90 weight GL5. This is what I like to use in these bikes, and it meets the specifications for BMW. Pretty cool containers, have a built-in pouring spout, so it makes it really easy to get the oil in where it needs to go. We have this in 500 milliliters and in 1 liter containers. If you're doing the gearbox and final drive, on all models, you'll need 1.5 liters. So a big bottle and a little bottle, or 3 little bottles. And for just the final drive, 500 milliliters is enough. There are different kinds of crush rings available, and these are the solid copper, solid aluminum. I stay away from the solid copper on most applications on the 2 valves because the threads are sometimes a little bit weak, and it takes a fair amount of torque to achieve a good seal. Aluminum, solid aluminum is a good option, and that's what BMW offers. But we also have these fiber-filled crush washers, just like, or very similar to, the ones that used to be available from BMW years ago, until they were probably taken out of the program because these are a lot cheaper to make. But these are basically a thin copper with a fiber inside, and the nice thing about these is when they compress, it doesn't take a lot of torque to make a really good seal. So I prefer these, especially on older boxers, final drive and so, because a lot of times the fasteners have been over tightened at some point in time, and want to go on as easy on them as you can so that they last a few more years. So using these new, or not new, old school really, fiber washers, I'm going to put the drain plug in the swing arm, which is part of the final drive housing. You can actually feel it mushing down, and you don't need much torque, and it's got a really good seal. Oh, and by the way, I always put these in with the seal side up, in other words, to the housing. So put that guy in. Okay. So it's a whole lot easier to put oil in the swing arm with the rear wheel off. So that's why I'm doing it in this sequence. The final drive, in this case, takes 250 milliliters, but you can do it visually. You're going to fill it up basically to the bottom of the threads in the opening. The newer final drives from 81 on, they take 350 milliliters, and the measuring isn't quite as accurate. So what's best on those, it has a little check plug in the back on the newer bikes. I'd just leave that in there and just take the vent off the top and pour in exactly 350 milliliters on the newer bikes. But on this one, we do it visually. We're just going to put oil straight in. Now the final, or the swing arm oil, it takes 150 cc's. On a short wheelbase, 100 cc's, because it's shorter. A couple ways you can do this. We offer these pretty cool syringes. We have them in 60 and 50 milliliters, so you could pour oil in here 3 times 50. Basically pour the oil in, put the plunger in. This is a great way to do it when you got the wheel on, but with the wheel off, it's a little quicker and just as easy to just simply taking a graduated measuring cup and get 150 milliliters in there. So as you can see with the rear wheel off, it's really quite easy to get a good shot at this and just pour straight in. You have to kind of pour slowly because it has to sort of spread out. That's why I don't like to use a funnel. It goes in too fast. That plug went in a little bit tight because the threads are a little bit buggered, but they'll work fine. But that's why it was a really good idea to use this soft crush ring on this one here. Okay, let's go on in. Okay, in preparation for reinstalling the rear wheel, we're going to put some grease on the drive splines. So what I like is this LM508. It's an anti-seize compound, but it's a copper-based product. It's really, really, really cool. And using something like this, like an acid brush, you don't want to put too much on. You don't need much. This really clings well to the metal. If you pack it in there too tight, you're gonna have that excess plug up those holes that we painstakingly cleaned out. So you're just gonna get in there and put a nice coat on these teeth all the way around, and being careful not to pack it on there tight at all, but to cover it very nicely. Okay, let's finish up that rear wheel now and put it back on the bike. Okay, the wheel has had plenty of chance to cool off by now, and so let's put it back together again. So I got all my seals laid out here. Got a new paper gasket here, and then this is, we're gonna replace the seal in this cover. You need something to kind of back it with. You can use a couple pieces of wood to stack it up. I got this gearbox shimming tool. It's not gonna take a lot of impact. Just something so it has something to fall through. Like that. And then put the new seal in. Go a little bit flush like that. And then just a smear of grease on that seal. And reinsert the spacer piece right like that. And we'll bolt it back together. Okay, the other side gets the thin seal, and the spacer goes in here once again. A little slab of grease, not much is needed, and put that on. Put this part in first, very important. And then, okay. I'm going to put a little bit of this LM508 on these splines as well, very, very sparingly. Okay, now I'm going to wipe off all the excess, so that it just left some on the teeth of the drive splines. Cool. And we're ready to put this back on the bike. So the tire wheel goes in pretty much the same way it came out, just in reverse order. Sometimes this can be a little bit of a tight fit. You could kind of finesse it in. Using a stock wheel size of 400 by 18, it's gonna go. If you run into too much difficulty, just a little bit of air out of the tires, it'll slip right past. But it would just... Okay. A little smear of grease on the axle. And now for the nut on the other side. Okay. And then don't forget to tighten the pinch bolt too. All right, now that the wheel's installed, we can check the brake adjustment. Because there's new shoes in here, you're going to want to constantly keep an eye on the adjustment. It may need to be adjusted periodically. But there's actually a reason why I went about this in this way, because the next important part is to tighten to install the driveshaft bolts. But I wanted to get the rear wheel put on first so that I can use the brake to lock up the final drive and I can get the proper amount of torque on those bolts. So that's the next thing, and then we'll have this rear end pretty well wrapped up. All right, let's hook up the drive shaft. Always replace these bolts. They're really pretty important. Connection between the motor and the drive wheel. I actually had them come loose on me one time many years ago. I hadn't installed them myself. It was on a bike, and it's not exactly a fun experience. So you want to use a good quality, medium strength thread locking fluid. Now before, when I had the gearbox out, I cleaned the threads really carefully in the flange, the output flange. And so now I'm going to take a little bit of this thread locking fluid on the threads here. I like to put quite a fair amount on there. And then you have to line up the flange and the drive shaft. And get one bolt in at a time. And you'll notice that I also haven't yet installed the battery box, because that would totally be in the way for what I'm doing right now. Okay, so I got the first bolt in. I'm just going to rotate the rear wheel a little bit to bring up the next one, and then get in there and get this one started as well. And by the way, I'm using the box end of a 10mm wrench for these bolts. Okay, so I've got all the bolts snugged down. This is where having the rear wheel and brake installed comes in, because I'm going to hold the rear brake on while I tighten these bolts. And we're talking pretty tight. You need to, if you break a tooth, you probably went too tight, but they need to be pretty tight. Okay, that's all good. Now the boot has to come back on in the clamp. There we go. Okay, now a little recap. What have we done here? In case you've missed any previous episodes, we've gone through rear main seal replacement, O-ring for the oil pump replacement, and clutch installation. We did swing arm bearings. We've resealed the final drive, and now we did rear wheel bearings. I'm probably forgetting a few things, but now the rear end is pretty much all back together. And what we'll do next is start to focus on the motor. So stay tuned for the next one.